Okie, it's just, there we go. It looks like we're streaming. And what I tend to do is just wait for a colleague to give me a thumbs up on WhatsApp to say, we are actually live and there's not a delay. It's okay. I've just got an error on the page saying Paul's talking about reciprocity, which is great last minute thing for me, but you're not. You're talking about guardianship. But welcome everybody to our 5th Wild Service book club, taking us through the chapters, each chapter of Wild Service, which is our recent book. And I'm delighted. There we go. Thank you, Patrick, for holding that up. I'm delighted to say that this week's book club is Paul Powesland, author of the chapter titled Guardianship, and the very wonderful naturalist, nature writer and journalist Patrick Barkham is here to interview Paul about that chapter. So you can hopefully you've read it already and maybe you've got questions too, but to take us through what it's all about. And Paul Powesland, of course, is the lawyer for the Right to Run campaign, friend of the river of the campaign, but also guardian of the river Roding. And I think couldn't think of a better person to write about guardianship for this book. So I'm going to hand over to both of you to continue.
Thanks, Nadia. So I'm Patrick Barkham, and I'd interviewed Paul on a number of occasions for various Guardian stories, and I had colleagues of mine sort of unusually sort of positive. Journalists often, secretly aren't very positive people, and they were unusually sort of rhapsodizing lyrically about how wonderful Paul was and his work was. And I went to meet him to interview him for The Guardian about 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And my piece, I don't write the headlines on my stories, and the piece introduced him to the wider world as the hammer-wielding barrister, which makes you sound very sinister, Paul. But I would describe you.
I would normally dislike that, but the headline was also had the river Roding is sacred and has rights, which I think is one of the first times that's ever appeared in a national publication about a river. So I'll forgive the slightly sinister subtext for myself, given how well the river was described.
Good. So environmentalists are many different things, and lots of environmentalists are a bit like, I can think of some who are like wise owls and others who are kind of quite fierce, like a grizzly bear. But Paul isn't any of those things. He's a wildflower meadow. He's a whole ecosystem. He's not only does he do amazing, brilliant sort of big picture thinking, big ideas and big abstract ideas, but he's amazing on detail and practicalities. And certainly, Paul, for me, you've really opened up both the big idea and how we go about bringing it into reality, and what you do, your mixture of advocacy and action and practical action is almost unique, I think, in modern environmentalism. And so I think it's absolutely amazing. I just wanted to start though. You mentioned before we came onto live stream that you are normally a barrister and in one side of the court, but you're currently in a different place in the courtroom. You're on jury service, and just tell us about the oath that you swore when you became a juror.
Yeah, so I should predicate this with saying I'm not allowed to discuss the case at all, but I am allowed to discuss the fact I am a juror and the oath that I took. So normally when you go on to be a juror, you have to either swear on a holy book and swear by Almighty God, or you give an affirmation, which is a sort of secular promise to tell the truth. And we were waiting outside the courtroom, and I said to the usher that I would like to swear on my river, and I'd smuggled in a bottle of Roding water that morning in a bottle. Although to take water into a court, you have to sip it to make sure it's not a bad substance. And I was like, when they asked me to do that, I was like, oh, I don't know what Thames Water have put in this. So I sort of put it in my mouth and then kind of subtly popped it back in again without swallowing any. So outside the courtroom, I said that I wanted to swear on the river, which is a deliberate thing. I've thinking for a while of what I could how I could use this opportunity as a juror to kind of advance rights of nature. And it feels like another way of reintroducing the idea of nature as sacred back into our legal system. The usher was like, we've never had that request before. Went into the judge. The judge was like, I went before and we've never had that request before. They sent me out, had a little discussion, brought me back in, had another little discussion. And I explained that, nature is my God, effectively. And the Roding I believe to be sacred. And I manifest love in action for her in all the things that I do for her, and that it would be a really meaningful promise to me. And in the end, we came to a slight compromise where I'd give the affirmation, so the legal bases were covered, but then afterwards I'd be allowed to give my oath. So on Tuesday morning in Snaresbrook Crown Court, I dipped my fingers into a cup of the Roding water and said that I swear on the River Roding, from her source in Molehill Green to her confluence with the Thames, that I will faithfully try the case and give a true verdict according to the evidence, which I believe is the first time that anyone's given a legal oath, particularly a juror oath, on a river. And I hope that many others follow suit, and that animism is soon found more regularly in our courts.
It's a brilliant piece of thinking and a brilliant piece of action, and I hope it gives us all, and it certainly gives me an idea if I ever get stuck on jury service. But wonderful, Paul.
Or ever called to give evidence in court. You know, there's lots of different times you actually end up sort of being having to give oaths. Like, you know, don't have to be just a juror. Witnesses as well have to give an oath to tell the truth, which you could also do on this as well. But it's this idea, I think, of maybe being a bit playful, like constantly finding playful ways to show and demonstrate to the world that nature is alive, that nature is sacred, and that we have duties towards it. I think there's, and I'm sure there are many other ways that lots of other people can do sort of similar things if you just have that kind of playful idea.
But yeah, and did everyone look a bit baffled in court, or could you see people maybe? It just gets you thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the usher was a bit baffled. Yeah, but no one in a bad way. And I think, I don't know if I was, you know, reading this into it, but I got a feeling from the judge that he felt the truth in my voice, that this was a true and meaningful sacred promise to me.
Yeah.
That it did matter, and that it wasn't just me sort of playing silly buggers.
Yeah. And so, Paul, just introduce yourself a bit more in terms of, tell us where you are at the minute, and where you live. If that's not too personal question.
Well, everyone knows. I think you put it in your article, Patrick. So everyone knows where I am. This is the River Roding behind me. I'll actually turn it round so you can see. There we are. She's actually looking really lovely this time of year. The banks are
looking gorgeous.
Yeah, replete with the reef, and you can only just see in the distance the little thing of the North Circular. Without that, you'd almost think we're in the middle of the countryside, and actually we're just on the outskirts of Barking there. And so if you can see, but the waters are just about gone clear. They're going to go cloudy again when it rains in a thunderstorm tomorrow, sadly. But I've been swimming in the river this week, and this is my little mooring where I live. This is my little sort of tree stump of sacred objects that we found in the river that we think people have put in as a form of worship. We've pulled out when we were litter picking. So it's quite a little mixture of objects there. And then this is my my boardwalks and the reeds, and I basically get to live in a jungle in London, basically, which is quite a rare and special thing. And that's, as you should probably also meet my trees. So this is one of the first trees that I planted. You can see the size next to my hand there, and up into the canopy. It's massive. So yeah.
How many years have you been there, Paul?
7 years. I moved here in 2017 and basically just lived by myself in a marsh, which was quite hard.
Cycling off into London to do your barrister work,
and then coming home into the marsh at night. Yeah, which I still do, but it's just like it feels less dodgy now. Like I've got my little steps down to the river to go swimming, and all my seating area and sauna and stuff like that. So it's like a bit easier to live here now. It's less hard than it was.
Good, but you don't actually own that bit of river, do you?
No. So this bit of the reeds here is adverse possession. It's unregistered, and I'll be able to register to own it after 12 years. But the actual river itself is owned by the Crown Estate. So the Crown owns all tidal waters in the UK, and this bit of the river is tidal. So we've got a 2-meter tidal range here. And I basically just moved here with no permission from anyone, and not really any idea entirely what I was going to do other than to just start a community project to restore the river, not really knowing what that entailed at all. No ecological knowledge, particularly about rivers, and yeah, no permission. And set up a Facebook group called Friends of the River Roding and just started doing it. So the first the first work day was just me by myself. The second, this random boater called Johnny joined me, and we picked 15 trolleys out of the river. And the Facebook group was originally just me and some friends. Now it's 2,500 people. And yeah, after a couple of years, the Crown Estate sort of noticed what we were doing, and we're like, sent an email, and we're like, hello, you're living on our river, we need to talk about this. But because we'd done good things, they were open to us carrying on doing that. So we set up a charity called the River Roading Trust, and leased the river from the Crown Estate. So now we're sort of more official, I guess, but still reasonably unofficial. You know, when we plant trees, there's land around here where I plant trees, I don't have permission to plant trees, and I still get in trouble with the Environment Agency as well. We're going to go back onto the way that guardianship can friction against bureaucracies. Do you want me to start bitching about the Environment Agency now?
Let's not. Let's save that for a little bit further down the line of the conversation. Because I just want to explore the concept of guardianship, because I think we've got a little sense of its practice, and we'll return to your practicing of it, because I do think it's compelling that you're both purveyor of big important ideas about environmentalism, but you're also a absolutely day-to-day practitioner living on the land. But in your chapter, you outline the fact that property is simply a label that describes relationships, and also the fact that ownership of land, in a sense ownership of nature, it bizarrely includes the right to destroy it. Tell us a bit about that, because that might surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, so I guess the best way to illustrate that is to understand that the way that humans currently relate to nature and land, humans have also in the past related to other humans in that way. And when they related to other humans in that way, it was seen as totally normal. And indeed, if anyone, not that long ago, 300 years ago, if you were to say that it is morally, ethically wrong to own another human being as a slave and to have the right to work them to death, effectively destroy them, people regarded you as a complete crank, basically. And so we've been on a journey over the past few thousand years of slowly transforming changing property relationships between humans into removing those relations to property and effectively making people what's called the subject rather than the object of rights. So you know, you have your own human rights, and you are your own human being, and you can't be owned and as property by another human being. So we are now, I think, on another journey, taking another step forward in that, and removing or beginning to remove those relationships normally ascribed to property from nature. And I guess I illustrate that again. I always like the practical example of things, so I illustrate it in the book by talking about my land. I actually, as I said in the book, own. This is my guilty secret. I own a riverbank on the River Medway. I know it's controversial in the Right to Roam crew.
This was a revelation to me that you're a member of the property owning classes, Paul.
I know. Well, just to be fair to everyone, I didn't inherit it from my family who stole it in the time of William the Conqueror. I bought it off people who stole it during the time of William the Conqueror. No, I bought it at auction 7 years ago. Actually, the same year I came to the Roading, incidentally. It's kind of interesting. A lot happened that year. And also the year that Lawyers for Nature really started up. So it's kind of a lot happened in 2017. Yeah, so I bought it at auction, and I care for it. And I generally describe myself as guardian rather than owner increasingly, because I find the relationship or the label of owner to be very impertinent. How dare I, a human with a maybe 100-year lifespan, claim to have control and ownership over a river that is tens of thousands of years old and will exist long after our society is gone? It's quite weird in many ways for me to claim that. And the field next to mine was this incredible meadow, and I came back one year expecting to find the meadow, and they just glyphosated and ploughed it into dust. And it happened again this year, actually. So obviously the book was written about something that happened a couple of years ago. It happened again this year. I came down, and you could literally see like a line of brown versus green, which is where the property boundary was between my bit of riverbank. And, you know, despite being a landowner, it's a tiny strip. It's only about 2 or 3 meters wide in places. But literally, because I look after it for nature, there is more life in my tiny strip than in a 100-acre field next door, where they just plow it to shit and use it for intensive agriculture. And yeah, I had a genuine realization that I had the power to, looking at this incredibly rich, beautiful place, that I had the power to destroy it, which to me seems completely insane. There's no tree preservation orders on my trees. There's no SSSI designation. So I would be free to chop down every tree, remove every blade of grass, cover it in glyphosate, and kill everything that moves on my land, basically. I could turn it into like a brown desert from this rich, beautiful Eden-like world. And yeah, I genuinely think that I should not have the power to do that, that we should remove that power to destroy from the bundle of rights that you have over your property. And that one of the best ways to achieve that is to reframe property ownership as guardianship. And I think there are different methods we can do that. You know, it's probably unrealistic to expect the government to pass a law. There'll be a lot of opposition from our friends at the Country Landowners Association and other such powerful, moneyed lobby groups who control large amounts of land in this country. But I think there are easy ways into it. For instance, starting with the many different owners who already see themselves as guardians and who already relate to their land in that way, and giving them the tools to put that on a more proper footing. For instance, can we introduce a rights of nature or guardianship style relationship through the use of conservation covenants, which are legally binding covenants that can exist on the land? Also looking at voluntary sector. So I recently spoke to the Woodland Trust and advocated for them taking a rights of nature and guardianship approach with their land. And obviously, they're already kind of in that zone, but not fully. And so it's like a little step for them and other conservation organizations to start relating to the nature that they own, in inverted commas, as guardians. And also state bodies. Interestingly, in New Zealand, the first where these sort of ideas have been trialed, the first places that have been turned over to guardianship hasn't been about expropriating private land. It's about what happens to state land. So the Crown owned a river, the Wanganui, and they gave it legal personality in a guardianship body. Or there was a national park, a sort of sacred mountain to the Maori people, which again was owned by the Crown and was given over into a guardianship body. So what about the Forestry Commission or the MOD or all of these state bodies that own hundreds of thousands, millions of acres? Can we start turning their land into more of a relationship of guardianship? And I think that would catalyze that movement in general, and then that could down the line be applied to sort of more private land.
So would that be giving a lot of power to new guardianship bodies? Would you be setting up a new body to kind of assess who's being a good guardian and who isn't?
Yeah, and that's a key thing. And we recently had a rights of nature, and we set up a UK rights of nature network for people working in this space last year. And we had our first away few days earlier this summer. And that was one of the questions that came up is, what does that look like? And yeah, I think in the same way there is a regime for charities, there would have to be a regime for guardianship bodies, sort of setting out who can set one up, how they can be set up, how they're sort of regulated, and there would have to be, I think, some state ownership, so some state sort of regulation for that, and oversight for that. What that exactly looked like, I don't know, but yes, I think something akin to what we currently have with charities.
It's all doable stuff, isn't it? I mean, it's like Charities Commission, charities are all regulated in that way. So there's no reason why it couldn't be all done. I guess it sometimes seems a bit like a distant fantasy, doesn't it, to change property rights in a significant way. Particularly we, the British, seem so wedded to a very old-fashioned concept of land ownership. Very restrictive, but I mean, concept.
And this is where I think the slavery thing comes back in. The abolition movement was effectively founded in 1789, and it was literally, I think, like a dozen people meeting above a shop in London, and they were genuinely seen as quite mad by a lot of people. They were challenging the economic idea at the heart of British industrialism and empire, the wealthiest industry that existed. They were trying to abolish that effectively, and people thought they were crazy, but and for many years they were seen as that. But within, what was it, 18 years, they'd got the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807. And obviously that was a very difficult campaign, but it is doable to change what seem like deeply entrenched and embedded ideas of property ownership within a matter of a generation, within years. And that's a bit as well. And the other thing is to look at as well is like look at the analogy of children and how we kind of, owners of land could be in the same situation as parents, as in, we don't want the state regulating every single thing, some state inspector telling you where you can and can't plant a tree, or how many blackberries you can harvest, or this kind of thing. We don't want that kind of level of detail of regulation. So we can have something akin to what we currently have with parents and children, where actually you're given quite a large latitude as to what you can do with your child. You can choose to educate them privately or in the state. You can choose to make them Catholic or Jewish or atheist. You can choose to take them to ballet classes or football, but you can't sexually abuse them, economically exploit them, beat them, or kill them. And we, I think, can extend the same things to owners in nature. If you own a piece of nature, you can, within reason, decide you want to plant an alder rather than a willow, or you can decide you maybe use it as turn it into a woodland or a meadow, but you can't just gratuitously destroy, pumping chemicals, put in rubbish, all of the many things that we see up and down the country. And also you have a duty to your nature to actively look after it, in the same way as you can't, it's illegal in this country to not get medical treatment for your child if they need it. It should be illegal in this country to not treat invasive species on your land if that's needed by your land, or anything else that your nature needs in order to be healthy.
That's interesting, Paul. To turn to the practice of guardianship, before we as a society try to embark on big legal changes, how do we as individuals step into the role of being a nature guardian? I mean, you're a very inspiring example of that, but I imagine a lot of us kind of think, well, where do we start? Where can we begin?
I mean, I always predicate this question by saying that, like, I did not grow up in like a nature-y family. Like, my family liked football and telly and never really nature. And so my family went into nature. I've never trained as an ecologist. All of my knowledge is just gained from experience, effectively, and just deciding that this is something that I wanted to step into. So I just want to predicate that anyone can, I think, step into this. I usually say there's kind of 3 key steps. The first is connection and knowledge, getting to know a usually specific part of nature, and then that knowledge and connection leading to love. I believe that if humans spend time in a specific part of nature, they will grow to love it. I think we're naturally hardwired to do that. And from that love naturally stems a desire to protect. In the same way as people protect their children because they love them, I believe we would do the same for nature. And that is sort of naturally hardwired into us. So yeah, I guess the roading example kind of shows that in action for me, I guess. I moved here on my boat, which is definitely an advantage, to be fair. Maybe it's a bit of an effort to have to go into your local woodland when it's pissing with rain in the middle of winter to increase your bond with it, whereas like I'm in my marsh, I'm in the marsh, I live in the marsh, I can't,
you're living very close to it.
Yeah, exactly. Every morning I've recently moved my boat into the reeds where I live here, and I was slightly unsure about doing that because obviously that involves cutting the reeds a little bit, but actually it seems to have actually stimulated nature, because actually I've got the reed bed here is about probably 2 or 3 acres, so it's quite dense in the middle. And I think I've noticed that where I cut it down a bit, the birds really love those edge bits because there's like a lot of sunlight and a lot of insects there, and they can access it easier. So like the little, I think they're reed warblers, but anyway, little brown little brown jobbies hanging out my window every morning, and I'm drinking my coffee. They keep flying around, like almost like they're kind of saying hello, like because they see me. Like, I'm sat like 2 feet away in a window drinking my coffee, and they're just like buzzing around, like, you know, eating little insects and things like that. So, you know, they're just like, I don't have to go to get in the car, go to a nature reserve and sit in a bird hide, because my life is a bird hide, you know, like I'm living inside a bird hide all the time. So that there is definitely an advantage there of living on a boat and living on the river. But yeah, that for me was that first step, spending my time here. But I think you can replicate that with things like swimming. And I think I realized one of the reasons that wild swimmers tend to be great protectors of nature is that it's a very, in some ways, intimate act, isn't it? You're like surrounded by the river. You're very much in it, as Roger said, with the frog's eye view of the world, which gives you that very intimate connection with nature, and with a specific river.
And you're suddenly very dependent on it too, because if it's in poor health, you're likely to be in poor health, you know, and
exactly,
you're likely
and
to get sick.
And that's where that final stage comes in. But I think, yeah, so just by spending time in it, by, you know, if you regularly swim in a river, I think you grow to love that place. And for me, living on the Roding, I've grown to love it. And then that third stage also, as I say, arises naturally, because, you know, I'm out on the river and there's like rubbish everywhere, and I'm like, this is fucking horrible. When I first moved here, there were these things, what we called shitbergs. There was like so much rubbish in the river that these giant islands of rubbish would just like float up and down on the tide, like massive, like kind of 10-meter square, like kind of floating. The coots actually used to really like them. They'd sort of like surf up and down on the river on them. Sorry, I've ruined their fun slightly by picking all the rubbish out. Or like, you know, as I say, with like water quality and sewage, especially if you're swimming in the river, like tomorrow the river is probably going to get filled with sewage because there's a thunderstorm on the way, and we know that when there's a thunderstorm anywhere in this catchment, sewage comes into the river. So tonight is the last night I probably get to swim in the river for a week or two, and that leads me to an intense desire to take on those that are causing that, i.e. Thames Water here, you know.
Tell us, Paul, give us a few more examples of the sort of things you've done through your self-anointed role as River Guardian. I know you've then moved it on and established, you know, community action and the importance of acting with other people and galvanizing a grassroots charity in that way. But I'm just thinking of the sand martins as another lovely example of something that you spotted and were brave enough and kind of imaginative enough to take action on.
Yeah, and I think I've been like pimping out the sand martins for a lot of examples. This might actually be the last time I use them as an example. Yeah, so basically I was cycling along the river, and right in central Barking, I noticed these birds flying in this really beautiful way. I didn't know what they were, and I started observing them and noticing they were like flying into a wall. And I sort of got my little bird book out and started reading into them, and realized that they were sand martins. And they fly over from sub-Saharan Africa, where they spend the winter, and then they usually nest in like sort of sandy cliffs where they scrape nesting burrows out of the riverbank. And obviously we don't have any sandy cliffs next to rivers or quarries in London, really, but they found old drainage holes in the river wall and colonized those instead. And I love taking people to this place. It's like, to me, one of the best contrasts between human and nature worlds. I think you've both been there, I think, both Patrick and Nadia, so you know what it's like. It's like there's a giant Wix store, a Shell petrol garage on the other side, a main road, like really heavy traffic, a Tesco Extra, a building site. It's not a beauty spot. It's also where like guys just come and piss everywhere, and then people throw rubbish, and then people piss on the rubbish, and then you're like, yeah, it's not good. It's like one of the least salubrious parts of the roading. And yeah, and they're these birds that are living their best life, like flying above the Wix car park to catch flies, and then going into their burrows. And anyway, so nobody knew they were there other than me, and I started then sort of publicizing the fact they were there. And then a landowner what came to the Crown Estate because they wanted to repair the river wall, and the Crown Estate contacted us as their kind of eyes and ears on the ground. And had they not done so, then it's very possible they would have ended up destroying the colony by doing the works in the season they were there, and or covering up the nesting holes. So I was able to advocate for the sand martins in that process, and said absolutely fine to do your works, but you need to do it outside of nesting season, and also reinstate all the nesting holes, and also ideally provide some more. And actually, bless their heart, the developers went really, the contractors went really overboard on it and provided 30 new nesting holes in this wall. They got really into it, and now the colony's future is assured, and hopefully they can expand as well. That's just one example of that, of where having someone with good local knowledge and a connection to nature can really make a nice difference. I think also that site is actually, there's another more recent example, literally only a couple of weeks old now, which I think is quite interesting, partially because it's I think going to be very relevant to what I think is going to be one of the biggest issues around nature protection in the UK over the coming 5 years, which is development. So I really actually want to write an article writing up my experience in this, called Beyond the YIMBY-NIMBY Divide, Why We Need Nature's Voice in the Planning System. And I found my perfect case study. They basically, on that Wicks car park next to the Sandmasters, they want to build 800 new homes in 4 25-story towers. And the plans are basically all agreed with the council. They did their community consultation, which basically means ignoring you normally, or maybe putting an extra bench in or something. And I basically went to them and said, look, I've got no problem with your new homes whatsoever, or these towers, or the addition of the towers. That's aside. But my job here is to make this development as good for the river and for nature as it can be, and to speak with their voice in this process. So by doing that, I kind of got rid of the NIMBY thing around, oh, you're just trying to stop houses being built. I was like, no, build your houses, absolutely fine, exactly the same number, but this has to be as good for nature as it can be within that. And it was really interesting. We had like 4 or 5 different meetings with them, and the first they were doing the usual community consultation thing, like, look at our plans, aren't they lovely? And I was like, but how is this good for the river? And they were like, look, our riverside path, we've designed the flower beds so that it's like channels flowing between islands. And I was like, I really wish I'd screenshotted my face at that moment. I was just like, I said, the river does not give a shit about your literary illusions. Like it just needs, native planting, as much greenery as possible, all of these things. So I negotiated with them, and using the threat that if they didn't come up with anything good, I would lead a local campaign in objection to their proposals, and also potentially legally challenge them. And there was like it's things like there was a existing strip of woodland along the site, and I was like, what are you doing with that? Like, we're getting rid of it, but it's fine, there's going to be a biodiversity net gain because we're increasing the amount of flower beds by 25%. And I was like, but the planting you're putting in is only about like 0.5 meter high, so yes, it's improved on square meterage, but not meter cubed of native foliage. So they're like, what are you going to do about that? And they were like, oh, good point. They went away, redesigned it, and put in like loads of trees and shrubs, so the meter cubed of green area was increased. I managed to persuade them to put an extra wetlands in. And this is the kind of where we got to on debates with this, is like, in the end, they were like, sorry, we can't put any more wetlands in because we've used up all of the available SUDS water on the site. There'll be no excess water, and we don't have enough to sustain any more wetlands on this site. That's not. This is where we should be. Not about like attenuating water going off the site. It's like, oh shit, we don't have there's not even enough water falling on the site to do any more wetlands or wildness now.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing we should be aiming for. And there was like one final issue where they were like basically going to stick a disabled car park on the edge of the site next to one bit of the river, which would look awful, and have a turning area. And I was like, that's just not okay, treating the river like that. Like having a car park next to it looks shit. And they were like, but yeah, we have to have this car park. It's a requirement for a disabled car park. There's nowhere else we can put it. There's nothing else we can do. And I was like, well, in that case, I object to the development, and we have to go from there. And they look pretty heartbroken because they had been working quite hard to kind of put my ideas in. And eventually I was like, can we not just be imaginative here? Like, I don't know, like put a green roof on it or something. And they were like, well, look into that. And they came back and they'd done like a whole thing where they'd put a hedge behind it, trees in between the car parking spaces, and then a green roof on top. So it all merged into one bit of greenery. And so basically at the end of that process, just speaking for nature, I'd like significantly increase, and all native planting throughout the site, that kind of stuff, significantly increase the value for nature of that site, and indeed increase the immunity for the people on the site as well. And that was only, we came in at the last moment. If they'd actually asked me from the start, when they actually first started designing it, I think it could have been significantly better whilst retaining all of the homes.
It's interesting because you're constructive work, and clearly you were very positive and helping them come up with new ideas, but you also had to carry a little bit of a threat, so to speak, with the fact that you had the River Roding Trust, and you could potentially mobilize community action. It wasn't just about, you know, you as an individual objecting, was it? Paul, just tell us a little bit about where you've run into obstacles. I know we talked about this a little bit before the live stream began, and I know a key part of your vision was to create a riverside path all along the Roding to open it up to lots more people. And you've done a kind of unofficial path along some bits, but that you had the River Roding Trust had some proper funding to create this path. But I gather you've kind of run into, we're familiar as environmentalists of sort of running into kind of evil money making big corporations, but there's also this kind of bureaucratic inertia that we run into a lot all the time, where perhaps even well-meaning organizations can't seem to facilitate positive change for nature at any kind of speed at all. Just tell us about your experiences there.
Yeah, I will, and I think it's probably something that when you really get into guardianship, you'll come up against a lot. I actually want to give an example of how I normally get round it, and to say why I've come up against a bit of a barrier with the path. So normally I get round official inertia and tedious bureaucracy. Sometimes there are good reasons for restrictions, and you know, we don't want people you know, completely covering reed beds in trees, or you know, planting up wildflower meadows or acid grassland with trees or something like that. There are sometimes reasons for restrictions we have to obey, but a lot of the time they are just pointless and just examples of people stuck in a old mindset effectively. So I normally get around that by ignoring them and daring them to stop me, which I do highly recommend to people as a way forward. If the change you're doing is positive and it's good for nature, I personally will go ahead and do it, and dare authorities to stop me. So, you know, I've planted trees where I'm not allowed to, even going so far as to sort of smash up the pavement in order to plant a tree in a pit in the pavement. And along the river.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul, but their bureaucratic inertia works in your favour because they don't get around to noticing the tree until it's huge, or they don't have the capacity to sort out the positive change that you've made.
Exactly, and that's a really crucial point. We're at a stage of like mild state collapse in Britain, where actually a lot of the time you can just go and do things, and they just don't have the kind of the power to stop you. Or, you know, some of them are also like, this is actually quite nice. We couldn't let you do this, but we're not against you doing this, if that makes sense. But there's also things like, you know, trying to naturalize the sheep piling. So the Environment Agency, or their predecessors, in their wisdom, came along and sheep piled huge sections of the Roding where I live, which is one of the worst things you can do to a river. By observation, I've discovered that it's just really, really bad. The sheep piled sections of the river are just dead, but there's very little wildlife in them, and very little greenery.
Just describe this to everyone. So this is where enormous metal pillars go in, and you create this hard edged barrier to
any kind of hard edge. Basically, nature loves edges and messiness. So, you know, I'll show you opposite. So, you know, over there you've got well, actually behind all that greenery there is a concrete river wall, but luckily over time nature has colonized in front of it, so you get this beautiful messiness of reeds and mud and edges and reeds hanging into the water where small fish can hide and where the heron can perch and the kingfisher can perch, which is amazing. If that was still just a concrete wall, there'd be no life there, because life can't really survive in concrete flat concrete down, and then just deep water. That's not what wildlife likes. So I started noticing this and then being like, okay, well, how can we try and change this? And you know, to actually do it professionally costs hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions of pounds. You have to have professional schemes that take literally decades to do, cost millions of pounds, where they set the sheep piling back and they do it in a 20-foot section and congratulate themselves of how wonderful they are. Anyway, I'm glad that you're on the road, so I can show you the example where I learned about this. So across the river there, you can't even see it anymore, but that over there, where that tower block is, used to be one of the world's biggest asbestos factories, and you can just see in the distance there's still a concrete wall there. And I noticed that a willow tree had basically somehow naturally jammed itself in to the edge of that wall and grown into that massive tree you can see over there. It's one big willow tree in front of a concrete wall. And what that had done, as well as naturalizing that bit, it had then caught all the silt upstream, and then reeds had planted themselves into the in front of the concrete wall. So again, that whole set of reeds there's a concrete wall behind there. So I was like, oh, nature can and does renaturalize edges. It just takes a long time. So I was like, what happens if I can speed up that process? So I started just taking willow cuttings, just putting them in the silt all along those hard walls, and quite a lot of them grew into willow trees. It's become a bit harder in certain areas because they're actually where they're going into direct deep water. It's harder to make the willows like water, but not that much water. So they're a little bit harder. But I've been trying different methods. Anyway, I recently met someone from the Environment Agency, and they were like, oh yeah, we've heard of you. And they're basically from the London flood defense team. So they're in the kind of, we hate nature, if it moves, cover it in concrete team, basically. So that's their thing. It's like they're trained in like, we must restrain rivers, put them in a straitjacket, concrete, metal, quickly. It's living, it's moving. We don't know what to do about it. It scares us. Let's destroy it. That's their thing. And I had a meeting with them, and they were like, yeah, we're not happy with you doing this because you're meaning we can't inspect our flood defense. And I was like, okay, well, I'm happy to negotiate with you if you've got a better method of naturalizing these areas, like setting the sheet piling back or putting in floating reed beds. I'm really open to all your suggestions. They were like, yeah, we don't have any money to do that. We can't really do that, I'm afraid. I'm like, well, you're not really offering anything then, are you? And they were like, yeah, but you need to have a flood risk permit. And I was like, I'm not going to get one. I'm just going to keep planting these trees. And if you want to prosecute me for planting trees whilst you're not prosecuting Thames Water for putting sewage into the river, then you're going to look very silly. And in fact, I would really love you to do that, because I think it would really open out quite a few political points here. And they were like, well, we'll come and take the trees away. And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure my ability, because this is free, these are just coppice willow, I'm pretty sure my ability to coppice willow and plant it exceeds your ability to come in and remove it, but we can try. Let's have a game here. And then and just sort of like challenging them in that way, and just say, I am going to do this thing. It's the right thing for the river. I believe it's the right thing to do, and I will keep doing it. And what you do in relation to that is up to you. But I think you're going to look silly if you try and just damage trees for no reason, basically.
That's an example. Retort, Paul. You always seem to have a good retort for authority. But can I just get you back to the?
But the problem with this path is basically
path.
So the path, there's this amazing the basic backdrop to it is that there's a riverside path from the Thames just up to past here where we are, and there's then a riverside path from Ilford all the way up into Essex. And there's this one missing section between Barking and Ilford that you have to walk miles out of the way around loads of estates and over railways and motorways, and it's not very nice. And the land is publicly owned. There's nothing being built on it, nothing you can build on it. It's floodplain and flood defences. And so I just cut a path, literally just went through the bramble and chopped any overhanging branches and created this path. Problem is that in the summer it always gets overgrown. So we need to have, put down some weed suppressant matting and put some gravel on top. That takes funding, about £40,000, which is nothing in the grand scheme of things. It's about a mile of path. And so we went to the mayor's office. I did a application, and we were granted £40,000 from the Mayor's Grow Back Greener Fund to put this path in. All we needed was landowner permission. Now, if someone had given me a pile of gravel, the path would already have been made years ago and it would be there. But the problem is I can't magic up gravel. And in order to get the gravel, I've got to get landowner permission. And TfL, that own the land, is like, yeah, we like this idea, but this, that, the other. You need to speak to the Met Police about the trees potentially encouraging antisocial behaviour, and maybe we need lampposts along here to give light, and what about this? And actually, we don't think even think you can engineer this route, because we think this is a £500,000 project. And I was like, you might think that, but actually you can do it a lot cheaper. Just trust. So this winter we basically went out and hired a digger with a local volunteer and drove a 3.5-ton digger down the whole thing to prove it was doable and like engineering wise possible. And now we're kind of stuck in a bit of a they still won't give permission, so we still can't get the gravel. If anyone can get me £40,000 worth of gravel, then please let me know.
Is that how much, Paul? 40,000? Is that the pounds in weight or pounds in monies?
Well, it's not an old-fashioned sweet shop, Nadia.
It's
money.
I've got 1 million questions. Patrick, do you want to close it off? Are you happy for me to dive in with some questions?
Yeah, can we have an ending that's positive about guardianship, not just me bitching about authority?
Yeah.
I don't want it to
No,
be like
exactly.
some kind of curmudgeonly Daily Mail.
Have we had lots of questions? Have we had lots of questions come in?
I've got about 8 or so.
Brilliant. Can I start with one?
Yeah.
I'm not being greedy, but so this is a question from me as an individual, Paul, asking your advice. So my local river is the River Bure in Norfolk. I swam in it this morning. It was amazing. And I discovered only recently that the sewage works for my expanding, sprawling urban village is the worst discharger of sewage into the Bure on the whole river system. And then literally it took me a few weeks to then make the connection that, sorry to even say this, my shit is going into the River Bure, whether I like it or not, through my village's sewage system. How do I, as a river guardian, begin to stop that happening, to challenge that?
So you need to have data, ideally. So try and monitor when, if they we actually managed to get all our data of sewage spills up on a live sewage spill map called an event duration monitor map. So now when the sewage overspills, well, legal ones on the roading, we at least know when it's happening. So if you have such a map, then use that. If you don't have it, you can pressurize them to give you the data by doing environmental information requests, effectively, which you're probably aware of, to actually find out when the sewage is spilling. You can then try and do calculations to find out if those are in exceptional circumstances or not, and therefore if they're legal. And then if they're not legal, start putting pressure on the water company to actually upgrade. I have found that we haven't achieved huge amounts on the roading because Thames Water just tell us to piss off, basically, when we ask them if they might want to stop acting illegally. But it's definitely by putting local pressure on and making the roading a problem river for them publicly, I think it definitely helps. There's a thing where rivers that don't have guardians acting for them, particularly those in poorer areas, are often just left. Like, because if Thames Water don't have to spend money, if no one's pressurizing to spend money on the roading, why would they? So if no one's creating that pressure, then they're not going to bother at all. So you can start getting local protests, start talking about it on social media, start getting press people to start calling the water company to ask about illegal sewage discharges from these waterworks, that kind of thing, and then start looking into the practicality of what it actually needs to upgrade. I mean, this kind of stuff is not, unlike planting a willow tree where it's pretty instantaneous, it's not instantaneous, but you do need to start kind of raising that pressure on them. And to me, local guardianship is pretty much the key way that's going to happen, because Ofwat and the Environment Agency are not going to do it on individual rivers.
It's not going to do it, is it? Thank you, Paul. Nadia, over to, and please, everyone, keep typing in, sending in your questions for Paul. Yeah, please do. Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, I can see one question going on for another 10 minutes. This is great. You guys are so lovely together. I'm going to also just be selfishly take up space and ask a question, because why not? And actually, this is for both of you. Paul, you mentioned, I'm going to take us way back to the beginning of the conversation, and you were talking about the ending of slavery and how this was like this huge, massive, dramatic moment, like seismic shift in terms of, and actually what made me write this down was you were talking about it really challenged our whole understanding of economy and money. And when it comes to money, that's a big thing to shift, right? So many of the problems that we're talking about come from disconnection, etc. But there's a lot of money saving stuff going on. Are we, and Patrick, you're a journalist, you're aware it's gone in the world. Paul, that you're involved in this. Are we in that time, do you think, for something with such a seismic shift? Are we actually there politically? Is the landscape here? Are we ready for it? I'm thinking about the Just Stop Oil protesters getting big sentences. I'm thinking about the tension between people who really want to save nature and then people who just can't understand it. Are we ready for the kind of seismic shift that puts nature first right now? And either of you can jump in on that. I mean, yeah.
I feel like society, in a sense, is always ready for that shift. We have to create it. We have, that shift could not happen in our lifetimes, but it also could, depending on what we do. And my experience is that I've seen just a few ordinary people who just decide that they want to start pushing this can make a huge difference. You know, a lot of people in this movement that were just people that were like, I want society to act differently, and I'm going to advocate for that. And it's already starting to shift the conversation and shift the dial. So yeah, it seems unlikely from the position we're in, but it also, as I say, seems very unlikely with slavery in 1789. I think in that sense, I think we're at the same stage. You know, we're at the same stage of basically the general picture looking really bad for any kind of change, but also committed people starting to coalesce around an idea and spread that idea into wider society. And I don't think it's going to be easy, but I also think it can happen, and it is up to us to create that. And what I do know for certain is that every single person listening to this right now has a role to play and can help shift that dial and can help bring about a rights of nature future, or a future in which nature is seen as sacred.
Yeah, well,
Nice.
well
Thank
Paul.
you,
I don't want to take up a huge amount of space on this one, but just to say that I don't think there's ever been a moment in human history where there's been more humans kind of acutely conscious of the pressures that we're placing upon the planet, and holding a desire to change, and to change, to live more gently with other species of all descriptions. And from that, there's an absolute outpouring just within Britain of community grassroots action by ordinary people, individuals, small groups, usually small groups, taking really effective local action for nature. And from that kind of concern for your local neighborhood nature comes so much more. And I do think there's a radical edge to that that's building too. I think in some respects politics has never been further from making there were kind of radical changes required, but you know, the conditions are becoming increasingly sort of to have the potential to change that, and to bring about sudden radical change can come out of nowhere, as we know from history, and it can come from relatively few people, relatively few individuals, and so much positive stuff happening out there, and we through mainstream media tend to only see the negative things, and there's so many people meaning well and doing good for other species and for nature.
And we have a more modern example, the water scandal. Up until I think it was 2015, 2016, these are multi-billion-pound companies that had effectively looted tens of billions of pounds from the waterways with no decent regulatory oversight. The Environment Agency Ofwat were not doing anything, and it wasn't a political issue at all, to the extent that Thames Water's current owners thought it was a surefire bet in 2016 to buy their shares. Now those shares are worthless, and they're worthless mainly because of political action, where the water scandal is now seen as a huge problem. And I would say the people that have been responsible for creating that is probably a few dozen people, committed, ordinary people, amateurs, a lot of them, who just like, right, we're not taking this anymore, and we're going to change that. So I believe we can.
Yeah, they're the inspiring stories, and actually there's so many of them where there've been huge movements. I mean, I even think of the Right to Roam campaign, right? Over a course of its life, there's only been 10 of us. Obviously with the backing of loads and members of the public, right? Sometimes I also think it's just a useful practice to remember these stories and read these stories, to not individualize, because I think one of the things that I hear a lot working in the conservation sector, a lot of like eco-anxiety and concerns is all about self. Like, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can fight this hard, and I don't think I can win this. And this idea you're not alone is, I think, super important.
And also think about what you're aiming towards as well. The Right to Roam is a good example. Obviously, we're aiming towards an act of Parliament that gives a new right to roam. But actually, hopefully that happens. But even if it doesn't, what Right to Roam has done has been incredible about shifting ideas of land ownership and relationship to land in this country. And I think we need to think about the same thing with guardianship and with nature. Even if we don't get a Rights of Nature Act 2030, there is still an incredible value in having nature guardians standing up and starting to protect individual bits of nature across the country. And that's why I love doing these talks as well, because hopefully some people will listen to this and just think, I'm going to stand up and do that too. We don't, and if they do that, that in itself is a worthwhile change.
Yeah, nice.
Just living in a relationship, living how we believe nature should be treated now in our lives, and just getting on with that is in itself an incredible victory.
Yeah, here to that. I've just got a question from Sophie asking about planning laws and how they need to change to take nature into account. And I know that last year Biodiversity Net Gain, or was it this year, came into effect. Paul, I'm testing your planning law knowledge. What needs to change there?
I mean, planning as a whole, I'm realizing there's procedural and there's substantive. So the substantive one is maybe a topic that's a whole other conversation in its own right, of how we actually bring planning into congruence with nature and rights of nature. But even procedural would help. At the moment, no one is actually representing nature in the planning system. And a lot of the time it's left to ordinary people who are then labeled NIMBYs. Now, some of those people some of them are using nature as a way to just oppose development they don't like. But a lot of the time it's actually just ordinary people. There's no one else speaking for nature, and they just step into the breach. Because ultimately the council is the one making the decision. You've got the law, you've got planning law, you've got the decision maker, i.e. the local authority, and then you've got people representing the interests of people. So local people will represent their interests, developers will represent their interests. Who's representing nature's interests? You know, when a developer builds flats next to the roading, who is representing the river's interests in that? No one. So we need to have someone speaking for the river. And that example I gave shows why it can be valuable. Even with exactly the same number of homes, the development was improved for the river and for nature just by me speaking for its interests in the process. Could have a really big impact, I think.
There's a couple of issues with Biodiversity Net Gain, which in theory is a kind of economic way of levering nature into planning decisions in a positive way, and it requires developers to create a 10% uplift in nature. But one issue is already, as Paul has shown with his example of the development by the roading, the devil's in the detail, and these net gain can kind of be conjured out of things that isn't gain at all, like destroying a load of trees and saying you've put in more flower beds. But also there's another issue that it can be, most developers will purchase credits, biodiversity net gain credits, which will mean there's nature increased elsewhere, but not where the homes are built. And particularly with houses, you want people to have access to high quality green space. It should be a modern day human right, as Amy Jane Beer has discussed. And you know, it's the danger is that you end up with nice nature uplift on some farmland 40 miles from where the homes are being developed. And this is going to be a big story in the next 5 years with Labour intending to build so many new homes.
Also, crucially, it's fundamentally a missed opportunity. And this, I haven't actually got my human beaver in things, so I'm going to crowbar it in here. Of, you know, we need to step away from viewing humans and our development and our activities as a negative, which we need to reduce the impact on nature as much as possible, and say that everything we're doing should in fact encourage nature, the way we live should actually be a positive boon to nature. I mentioned that example earlier about me putting my boat in the reeds and trimming the reeds, and actually the birds liking that impact on them, you know, because it's like creating more sunlight to that part. Or people coppicing, so getting wood materials, but by coppicing they increase the richness of woodlands more than if those woodlands were uncoppiced, unmanaged. And you know, with that example I gave of that flat, of the flats being built, you know, I only came at the end of the process, so I was able to kind of tinker with some details, and I got some good stuff in. But to me, we should be going right back to the start and being like, okay, we've got this site, it's currently a manky old car park. How can we truly make this as rich as possible for nature, whilst also providing homes for people? And for my thing, being truly radical, we would like it used to be a marsh before the 19th century. So what if we would like reset the river wall back to encompass this site, so the tide then flows over it, and build like giant towers on stilts above a restored marshland? So it was actually like birds living in a marsh with people living above that, which would also be fucking cool, living in like towers in a marsh, right? That's the kind of thing we should be aiming at, not just like how can we still build our shitty Barrett homes while sticking a bird box on the front. You know, like we need to really be thinking truly radically around how we're living and how we can actually build in a way that actually is a massive positive gain for nature.
I love that, Paul.
Were you grimacing when I said shitty there? Was that a grimace?
No, well, you said shitty Barrett home, and I was like, oh God, what if someone's in a shitty Barrett home and we're watching this? But
it's a game
is
for us, you
great.
know. It's an absolute game for us, and it's like happy homes for us if they're surrounded with high quality green space and bird song and you know, and oxygenating trees and all of this stuff. It's an absolute gain for all of us, for every single person.
Net gain.
Actually, that's a much better way of putting it.
Yeah, it totally is. And actually, I was driving up towards Loch Tay at the weekend in Scotland, and passed somewhere called the Crannog Centre, which Crannog is a Scottish, I think, God, please, is someone Scottish correcting me. It's like a dwelling that was on the water. And I was just thinking about that when you said, like, why can't we have these buildings above the marshes? We know how to do this. We've done this before. We can do this again. And that's so cool. And it reminds me of that example you gave earlier about the parking lot with trees in between the parking bays and the green roof. Like, actually, we are incredibly creative and brilliant engineering minds as humans. And developing and having things that we need isn't incompatible with nature in the slightest, if we're willing to think really and just go, what would work here to have everything. We could do that. We've not got
and live so much more richly as well. I know. And having birds nesting in your walls and having a green roof where you can like lie in a meadow, all of these things. Like I truly believe that we can just be more imaginative and provide greater richness both for us and for nature. And it's definitely within our ability as a species to do that.
We've got about 8 minutes left. I'm kind of making up the length of this. I'm hoping you guys are okay with that. And there's a couple of questions I really want to get to. One of them is about community, and how has the local community's relationship to the river eroding changed, Paul? But also crucially, has their relationship to the river eroding changed, as well as how they are relating to each other? So as they relate to the river differently, are they relating to each other differently as well?
I mean, this area is not the easiest sell for community projects. I think that's something that has to be recognized in environmentalism. Areas with greater poverty, people have less time and less capacity to do environmental works, which is why a lot of the most active environmental organizations are in wealthier areas, and therefore those areas are often have disproportionate protections for nature. I'd be interested to see a study if there were more TPOs in wealthy areas, tree preservation orders. I'm almost certain there would be, as well as being more trees in general. And I'm pretty certain there'd be less sewage spills in wealthy areas because there's more people to complain about it. So it hasn't always been easy here. And we get around 20 to 30 people in our volunteer days now, which is good. But I think to be truthful, I think quite a lot of people in local areas still wouldn't come to one of those days, and I'm not entirely sure how to entice people to do that. I do think people see the river differently, and one of the nicest things about the Friends of the River Eroding is not even people just coming to the volunteer days, but also just posting pictures of the river or their experiences of the river as a child, and just seeing the river as something which is loved and that they come to love too. But if anyone has any ideas of engaging communities in river restoration more, I'd love to hear them, because it's not something that I necessarily am expert at, if I'm honest. And I think through my work here, I think I've maybe kind of overcome some of the critics. I think some people probably still see me as like a mad barrister living in the marsh, wondering why I'm so mad.
I doubt that. I can imagine that the ripple effects that you've created are far beyond what you've been able to tell us just now, Paul. People know when a place is loved and cared for, and how communities that haven't necessarily engaged in the roading project, I'm sure, have used that space now to commune with each other. I'm sure. And
actually, just making the river more well known has been actually quite interesting. It was quite a forgotten river. I've sort of popularized it as being. I went away and sort of researched all the different sizes of London rivers, and by comparing length and discharge, I've reasonably safely concluded it's the third biggest river in London. And now I just kind of always say that, and I think it's becoming well known as a stat now. And I think I think the river roading is like significantly more well known in general discourse now than when I started this project, and that's also quite important. You know, people regard it as special and as as known, and that not just a forgotten backwater full of trolleys and rubbish and sewage.
Can you just imagine if everybody was a bit Paul Powesland, and in a week our whole ecosystem, I think, would change if everybody was able to challenge in the way that you do, Paul. I'm gonna just ask one more question, and then I would like to just invite you both to share closing thoughts and comments, anything that you feel like hasn't been said. But there's just and also just to say in the chat, there's lots of people giving you support, or the idea of guardianship and nature having rights, lots of support there. But around people studying law and learning about this kind of stuff, would that make a difference if people who, is that like in the curriculum for when you study law, and do you think it would benefit to change how people learn the law to encompass nature's kind of rights? Or, I mean, I don't actually, this is going to short my knowledge of like how lawyers are involved in the planning system anyway. Do you think that's a route?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely a route. It's not done at the moment. You know, the closest we get is environmental law, but even then it's like that's still applying human-made laws to the environment, often for ourselves. You know, we rivers need to be free of pollution because we want to swim in them. So yeah, rights of nature is still pretty fringe in the mainstream legal world, but I'm trying to make it less so by talking about it and advocating for it and doing mad things like trying to swear oaths on rivers and things like that.
That's beautiful, mad but beautiful. And Patrick, I'm going to ask you to share any final thoughts that you've got, and then end on Paul's kind of message to everybody around guardianship.
Oh, I'm really struck when I meet and talk with Paul and with you, Paul, of the similarities between your approach to environmentalism and Roger Deakins, whose biography I wrote fairly recently. And Roger was this wonderful combination of tremendous optimism and also anger, and he got really angry, and his anger could be very self-destructive, but he used it quite constructively in his environmentalism, and he championed neighborhood nature sort of 40 years ago, which is pretty prescient of him. And then with you, I don't see the anger, but I see the bravery. So as well as your optimism and positivity, I see the bravery of your actions informed by your legal knowledge. And I just think that's something that we can all learn from and be inspired by in a truly genuine and constructive way. And so I do think, you know, words like inspiration are used too lightly, but you are really an inspiration, Paul, and you're living your values in a beautiful and pure way. And I do think it's so helpful I just love your latest example of being in court and bringing the river into court in that way and having that playfulness and creativity. And sometimes as environmentalists can get all a bit doomy, can't we? But if we can think of a fun way of protecting our sacred space, our local space, our natural space, then we've got to seek the fun, because then we can be certain that other people are going to join in.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I try to keep the anger down and keep it to playfulness, but you've also never seen me in a catchment partnership meeting when I'm tearing Thames Water a new one. It does come out occasionally when I feel like I'm being taken the piss out of, like I am with
I
Thames
would pay
Water.
to see that, Paul.
I've tried to be nice. Yeah, what's my message? I mean, I guess the overriding message is we need to create a whole new system of relating to nature as both sacred and as guardians rather than as owners. And that is kind of daunting because it means changing many different ways about how society operates, but also it's kind of, I think, creative and fun, and crucially it's within all of our hands. You know, we ultimately all together create how our society operates and what it values, and we can all rewrite that at any time. And so anyone listening to this can be a part of that. You can decide right now that you want to relate to nature differently and act as an inspiration for others to do the same thing, and you can step into that role. So, you know, the 3-stage thing: find a bit of local nature, spend time with it, fall in love with it, and act to protect it. And in your mind, shift the way you're acting towards different parts of nature as being a human, possessing or dominating or owning them, and towards guardianship. Think in your mind that you are its guardian, and start acting accordingly, and I'm sure you will inspire others. And I truly believe that a crucial way this change is going to occur is hundreds, thousands of people around the country all doing that on different rivers and forests and lands, and then joining together to create that new kind of reality. So it's it's up to all of us, but also crucially it's quite fun as well. Like I was at the station in Barking a couple of months ago, and it was springtime and all my trees were coming out, and I just love going around and seeing how they're doing. And I just thought about those trees that I planted, and that I get to cycle past them every day and see how they're doing, and I get to live in this place here with these reeds and this beautiful river. And I just started laughing to myself at how joyful that is, and what a wonderful privilege it is to live that close to nature, and to have the power to change it, and to see it grow and bloom and blossom into something richer and more beautiful. And so although it's not always easy and it is often hard, do try and see it as a beautiful opportunity, because it is really, being a guardian of nature is, to me, one of the best parts about being alive.
Oh, Paul, I needn't say anything else tonight.
Yeah,
Thank
let's
you,
end it
everybody.
there. That's a
Let's end
beautiful
it there.
note to end it on.
So
Well done,
beautiful.
Paul.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody. See you next time, where we'll be with Nick Chester talking about community. Have a lovely evening. I'm just going to stop streaming.
Bye.
Okay, we stopped.